Good day, everyone. Today we will be discussing the terminologies required for the understanding of the coursework that you will be expected to complete for this semester in this subject. So, with quantitative methods, what we are supposed to be learning in here will be the tools that one uses in research. That is, the tools that one uses for the data collection, processing, and interpretation of such data with the objective of providing reasonable interpretation and rational conclusions. So the terminologies that we will have to deal with include the following. So when we deal with research, it will be imperative, or it is a necessity that one understands what variables are. You have studied this in your senior high or in your high school training, as well as in the other subjects related to the development of quantitative reasoning. So a variable is a characteristic or a quantity of a phenomenon that can be measured or classified. So these variables from the terminology tells us that these are not fixed quantities but change through time or through some form of characterization. So these variables change their measurements through time or across units. So let's say if we're dealing with age, my age is different from yours and different from others. While there may be some with the same ages, this quantity will not be fixed across all units. So with variables, we will have to look at the difference between conceptual definitions and operational definitions of variables. Pag sinabing concept, it's an idea. So when you look at a variable, it will be dependent on the perspective that you view these variables from. So a conceptual definition explains to us what the variable would like to characterize or to capture, while operational definition would be the meaning of that variable with respect to the study. Okay, so it will have to be the scope of the meaning of such variable within the context that it is used in that specific study. What would be the role of providing an operational definition? This operational definition will guide all who will use or will appreciate the results of your study as to the meaning of such variable, which generally will require some form of adjustment in the general definition of such variable. Okay, according to types, there are different types of variables. We could look at the difference between an independent versus a dependent variable. When we look at a linear equation in the senior high math that you have had, when we have a linear equation, we have y is equal to mx plus b. Therefore, we generally conventionally say that the dependent variable is the y in the equation and the x is the independent variable. What does this mean? A dependent variable will have to first identify the corresponding variable which in the given equation is x, so that its value could be determined. Okay, while the independent variable x is given the full consideration that it can be what it wants to be or should be. Okay, so when we look at a dependent variable, it means that its measurement will be known only with the knowledge of the corresponding independent variable, while the independent variable will be known through the measurements that are made within the context of the study. For discrete and continuous variable, the difference will be for discrete variables, it can only assume specific integer values. That means it's countable, okay? While a continuous variable will be defined within any 2 points and across that range of points between any 2 points that the variable is defined in. For measures of variables, we have 4 measures, which are nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. These types of measures will also tell us the degree of that measurement to fully reflect the character of the phenomenon, okay, of the variable. So with nominal, that's the weakest measurement, and ratio would be the most powerful. So for quantitative methodologies, we generally will be the measures of choice. Okay, that means that if you will have to use the nominal and ordinal scale, explore the possibilities of extracting either an interval or ratio scale first. But if there is no other way than characterizing or measuring the variable for your study, then you can use the nominal and ordinal scales, understanding that this limits the characterization or the details that one can provide with respect to the behavior of the variable. So the nominal scale will be a form of providing groupings. Like when we classify people as male or female, it's not very clear as to who will be female or who will be male when someone is between these two distinct categories. When being male or female is critical to the characterization of the variable under study. Okay, pag sinabing, let's say, freshman, second year, okay, third year, and fourth year, there are individuals who do not belong into the fixed category of first, second, third, and fourth. These are the irregular students. So when we do have the nominal or categorical scale, there you see, okay, explicitly the difficulty with categorizing some individuals who are part of the units of study. For the ordinal scale, you have the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth, and you also understand that classifying someone as first, second, third, and fourth, we are unable to refine how to understand the difference between one classified as first, second, third, and fourth. For the interval scale, there is a fixed interval between any 2 points. But when you want to compare these interval values across units of the study. It's not very clear how they compare. An example of this is when we look at income, okay, or when we look at viral attacks to a computer system. So when we look at the tally on the viral attack on a computer system, that's only a tally, and we don't understand the number of operations that that computer system undergoes. So if you have a high volume of computer attacks on a computer system that seldom is used, then that will have a greater measure than one which is a busy computer system with probably the same number of attacks. So for a very busy computer system having, let's say, 100 malicious viral attacks in a day over a computer system with very low volume of operations in a day with 100 viral malicious attacks, then the 100 does not reflect truly the measure of that attack with respect to the volume of operations in these two computer systems. So the best measure will still be the ratio scale, because when we look at the ratio, these are directly comparable across the study units. Like when we look at the percentage of malicious viral attacks on a computer system, because then we have the denominator for the percentage as the total number of operations on a computer system, then we get to have a very clear understanding of what threat is imminent or is clearly manifested by this percentage of viral attacks. So when we look at variables with respect to quantitative research, we get to understand that we will have to measure the phenomenon with respect to a variable that represents that phenomenon. Okay, so when we have a clear understanding of what variable can truly represent that phenomenon, then we are properly oriented as to what truly represents that phenomenon. Okay. Now, if we look at a research study, you always will have to bear in mind that the scope of the study is far bigger than what the researcher can truly identify and study. So if a population consists of, let's say, for the computer system of Bicol University that is linked to the computer network, then we need to identify all the computers linked to it. Okay, and so there are so many of them. And to study each one of them will not be recommended because of the bulk of work and also the imposition of controlling the quality of data that one will have to generate for the study. So generally, for any research, the population units that is targeted for the study will be large. Sometimes it's even very large, and generally it is unknown. But this population can have representative units called the sample. So for characterizing the population, we call these characteristics as the parameters of the population, and the sample characteristics are known as statistics. So a sample will have to be unbiased to represent the population. If it is a biased set from the population, then one cannot generalize from the results of the study of a sample to be relevant to the population. only an unbiased sample can generate conclusions that are true about the population. So it is very important that one understands that only with an unbiased sample can one generalize about the population. Ang research po, ang objective natin sa research is to characterize the population, to conclude about the population. The conclusions will not be about the sample units because you are not providing a case study. Pag case study, it's easier because your conclusions will only be applicable to what has been studied. So a sample will be generally small, subset of the population, but it is known. Okay? Yet, it is incomplete. It's not the total set of study units, but because it is representative, it can mirror the characteristics of the population. So, with the importance of providing an unbiased sample, we need to understand these sampling techniques, how to generate the sample units which will compose the sample for the study. So we distinguish between probabilistic techniques, sampling techniques, and non-probabilistic sampling techniques. The probabilistic sampling techniques provides specific relative frequency of any unit in the population to be selected as part of the sample. Yung non-probabilistic sampling techniques will not associate a specific probability or relative frequency of any unit in the population na maka join as part of the sample. So, some of the probabilistic sampling techniques will include cluster sampling, stratified sampling, okay, proportional sampling, simple random sampling, and variable sampling. The variable sampling technique is not generally used because it requires that one is able to identify which of the subpopulation has the greatest variability. Pag masyadong dissimilar ang subpopulation, kukuha ka doon ng mas maraming subsample units kaysa sa subpopulation na yung variability is low, meaning the units in that subpopulation are more similar. You get less sample units from that subpopulation. Okay, we will explain in detail all of this when we come to the specific topic on sampling techniques. For non-probabilistic sampling techniques, this include quota sampling. Ano ba yung quota sampling? Quota sampling will be when you determine your sample size, and what you do is to select the first ones that are available. So there is no effort of representing the population. The effort of the researcher is to be done with the research as fast as he can, regardless of whether the sample that he uses is unbiased or biased. So if you use a quota sample, the sample that you will be using for your research is from the initial stage of the research will be biased and therefore can only generate conclusions which are applicable to the sample units. One other non-probabilistic sampling technique will be convenience sampling. Convenience sampling would be that you reach out only to units of the population that you are familiar with or are easy to access. Like when you have telephone interviews, no? Which are the convenient sample units? The convenient ones are those who answer your request for an interview over the phone. Okay, so there is no effort of representing the population. One non-probabilistic sampling technique will be the purposive sampling, which sampling technique may be useful specifically for you in the BSIT curriculum if and when your target would be the assessment of the efficiency or the technical viability of a software or a prototype that you would have to develop or would have developed for your thesis. Yung purposive sampling will require somebody who has the credentials or the expertise to be able to work on whatever it is that you request this individual to do. So, kung magpapa-assess ka ng efficiency ng software mo, you cannot randomly identify your juror from any set of individuals because the basic requirement for you is to identify people who have the expertise to provide a highly technical assessment of your output for your research. Research designs will have to be identified prior to data collection because research designs will have a counterpart on research methodologies. So research designs can be categorized between experimental design and quasi-experimental designs. Okay, so ang experimental designs are those that are restrictive. Why? Because in an experiment, you only will have to track a specific variable or a set of variables. All the rest of the factors that are relevant to the experiment are controlled and fixed. So pag sinabi nating fixed, ibig sabihin, let's say, you need to have a temperature, normal room temperature. Ang normal room temperature can vary slightly. So, technically, hindi sasabihin natin 30 degrees Celsius. But for an experiment, it will have to be within that range na kung mag-fluctuate man siya, it will have to be very insignificant fluctuation. Okay, all the rest of the factors will have to be controlled, okay, to be the same across all the processes of the experimental study. For quasi-experimental designs, this will be a distinct category of research designs, which tells you that some of the factors that are relevant to the behavior of the variable under study cannot be controlled. So we will delegate them as quasi-experimental designs, and this will include the social research designs where some of the factors cannot be controlled. So for research designs, we have corresponding research methods, and we have the quantitative and the qualitative. So quantitative research methods would identify that the variable measurements will have to be numeric and that the instruments for measuring these variables will have to be standardized. Okay, for qualitative research methods, the instruments for measuring the variables may be standardized, but there is a difficulty with fixing the measure from one study unit to another. That's why it's called qualitative. And qualitative research methods generally will rely on the expertise of the researcher. While for quantitative methods, the dependence will be on the instruments used for measuring the behavior of the variable and the capacity of the researcher to meticulously abide by the research protocol to be able to adequately or accurately measure the variable. Okay, so far so good. And then we have what we refer to as the scientific method. When we refer to the scientific method, that means we're trying to provide conclusions that are evidence-based. That these conclusions cannot just be generated with some processes that a researcher can adjust at any time of the research process. Okay, so a research method will define a set of steps which needs to be followed and observed in toto, verbatim. Okay, so for the scientific method, what we do is to provide a hypothesis, a set of hypotheses. Okay, the hypothesis would be stated as a null hypothesis and an alternative hypothesis. The null hypothesis is a declaration, a passive declaration about the behavior of the variable, while an alternative hypothesis is an active declaration of the behavior of a variable. What is a hypothesis? The hypothesis is an observed behavior of the variable, and what you would like to prove in that research is that your observed behavior of that variable would be supported by the data that you have generated for the study, which means that when we say passive statement for the null hypothesis means that we generally will state equality of a characteristic to a fixed value. Let's say if you would like to look at the efficiency of an antivirus application or software that you have developed to be, let's say, equal to 75%, and upon your observation of antivirus which your developed software belongs to, and that you develop this with a specific capacity to provide a finer capability of some of your subroutines. Therefore, you actively state that your antivirus applications will surpass the 75% efficiency. So what you're saying is to actively say that you have developed this software so that its efficiency to prevent malicious attacks on the computer system to be greater than 75%. So where do you get the 75%? The 75% will either come from previous studies or previous declarations of the efficiency of software, an antivirus software, which are of the same rank as that which you have developed. Let's say alpha version ka pa lang. So gagawin mo na ang reference mo for the efficiency will be alpha versions of antivirus software. Pero kung nag-beta version ka na, higher version, so your reference will no longer be 75%. So you will again refer to the efficiency of beta versions of the antivirus. Okay, so as you go through the development of your applications, your reference will be to the same category as that which your software belongs to. Okay. For the experimentation and research protocol, with the scientific method, there is no way that you cannot declare a valid protocol. where do you um, where do you refer to when you develop your research protocol? Generally, you refer these to researches which have been completed and which is similar to your field of inquiry or to your study. But it does not prevent you to refine the protocol. Refinement of any protocol will be dictated by what you would like to generate and in which direction you would like to do. Okay, so the emphasis in developing an experimental or and research protocol is to provide steps which are anchored on the science. Okay, so ibig sabihin, for every step in any protocol, you need to validate that as justified by the science where this belongs to. So, if you refer your protocol to a research experimentation, let's say in biology, chemistry, or any field of specialization other than information technology, but you would like to insert some steps which are relevant to information technology, then the anchors to the inserted steps will have to be in information technology, in the science of computing and information technology. So for data collection, processing, and interpretation, you will have to abide with in the data collection the processes which you have declared in the research protocol, and in processing you will have to use statistical methodologies, mathematical methodologies, which will be validated as appropriate for the research design which you have adopted. And interpretation of results will have to be the technical interpretation. So, ang maganda sa research method is you will not be compelled to develop language skills as that which is the pride of the College of Arts and Letters. Hindi tayo gumagamit sa technical discussion ng mga kataga or language which understanding um, may be dependent on who reads um, your narrative. So for technical interpretation of results of research, you will have to use technical language, which means the least words and direct to the point. For conclusions will have to always be evidenced by the results of your study, and this really will be initially rooted on the methods which you have observed or adopted for the generation of your data, and the quality control imposed on the entire process for your research. Conclusions will have to adopt an error level for the conclusions, because in research you always will have to understand that it is not free from errors, but also understanding that such errors are not willful o hindi tinutuyo, but that these errors can occur randomly but are insignificant as to affect the conclusions of the study. So when we look at the declaration of the possibility of errors in research, we look at two types of errors, type 1 and type 2. Okay, type 1 is false positive, type 2 will be false negative. What is a false positive? A false positive is when we declare that the characteristic is manifested when in truth it is not. So, the false positive, as defined in the scientific method, will be to reject the null hypothesis when it is true, and the false negative is to accept the null hypothesis when it is false. So, to have a working understanding of what this really is, let's say if you look at the COVID-19 PCR testing, yung false positive will be pag PCR test ka ng swabbing, when you have your swab test and you are declared by the results of the swab as COVID positive. So, ang false positive will be dineclare kang positive for COVID when in truth you don't have COVID. So, that's false positive. What's a false negative? Okay? Sinwab ka naman and sabi sa'yo, wala kang COVID and you are sent home. So, when you're sent home, you feel like there is no worry of confining yourself to a self-quarantine area within the home because the swab test has declared you to be without COVID-19, not infected by COVID-19. So false negative would mean meron ka talaga sa totoo lang. Pero yung swab test mo, sinabi sa'yo na wala ka. So when we look at this, we will have to decide which is better for you for a specific case. Would you rather be false positive or false negative? So as an example, para lang mapag-isip-isipan nyo, just try to muni-muni kung alin ang mas maganda para sa'yo na i-declare kang false positive for COVID-19 or false negative. So, depende sa rason, both can be considered as a reasonable choice between these two. So, laging depende sa rason mo kung masasabi natin na tama ang pinaninindigan mo o mali yung pinanindigan mo. Okay? So, for quantitative methods, which is what we will be learning in this subject, we will refer to tests of hypothesis, which tests are either parametric or non-parametric. Pero we will be focusing more on the parametric tests, which will be within the domain of inferential statistics. And for quantitative measure, there will be a meticulous focus on the measures that you will have to adapt for a particular variable to be able to fully characterize your phenomenon, the phenomenon that you would like to address or cover in your research study. Quantitative methods will always maintain objectivity in the entire process. So, an objective view of any component of your research would mean that every step, every little thing that you adopt for your research process will always be evidenced by reasons that are rooted on science. Okay? So, hindi pwede dito na paiba-iba ka ng perspective. Once you have declared your perspective doon sa initial step, all throughout, you will have to maintain the same succeeding steps from step 1 until the last phase of your research. Okay, so ibig sabihin there is total quality control for the entire process in any quantitative inquiry. Okay, why do we have to ensure that we adopt a valid protocol, research protocol for any research? Okay, this is because we would like to ensure that anyone who doubts the results of your study can replicate your research, and if you truly have observed the protocol which you have declared in your research, that someone who doubts the results of your study and replicates it will arrive at similar conclusions or similar results. Ibig sabihin, they will not differ statistically from the results of your study. Once the results of your study and that of the one who doubts your study, there will now be the possibility that either this person who wants to verify your results or you have transgressed some of the steps of your study or have willfully manipulated the results. So mahirap ito. And this has happened in many researches, and this will have to go through a process by which a third party may be tapped para mag-referee kung sino ba talaga yung may problema sa dalawang to. But some big research facilities have committed this unethical mistake. So maraming researchers na gustong makalamang, and by manipulating the results of their study, they have declared conclusions or results which are amazing and which everyone would have wanted to reach but were unable to reach. And when a researcher or a research facility declares a specific result, some other researchers, okay, who are interested in the same field of work will immediately verify, replicate your study, because you need to declare your process. And when they have meticulously followed your research protocol, tapos mali yung results nila, significantly different from the results of this other researcher, then there will be a declared declaration of some unethical practices. And dito, nawawala ng kredibilidad ang mga researchers. Let's say, di ba yung Dengvaxia? It was declared to be a medicine that could address or control or arrest the ill effects of dengue. But when it was used in the Philippines, it was verified to be wrong. So, binalik doon sa nag-declare na this medicine was good for dengue. This vaccine was good for dengue. So, a similar case is impending for this vaccination on COVID-19. Time will tell us if this form of control for COVID-19 would be either an ethical declaration of the strength of the vaccine to control the spread of the virus, or that it is something that will be declared as unethical. So, we don't know. Bakit ko sinasabi to? Kasi, if as a child you were given the polio vaccine, that will prevent you from getting polio. But if you have been vaccinated in your childhood or any time of your life where it was declared that the polio vaccine is an effective, okay, is an effective prophylaxis or pang prevent ng polio, and then in your life you get to have polio, you will have to ask whether that polio vaccine was truly the preventive measure. So, dito sa COVID-19 vaccination, yung na-vaccinate na, some of them still get the COVID-19. So, that will have to be a question that can be settled through time. Okay? So, with quantitative methods, we also are able to provide accuracy. When we declare, let's say, if you're trying to declare a behavior of a dependent variable. Okay, so if you have an equation that approximates that variable, you do not assume that the quantity according to the equation will be fixed as to that quantity. So lagi, in a research, you always provide a plus and minus the standard error. Ang sinasabi na itong quantity to will not be exactly be equal to this value, but its value is approximately within the range of this quantity plus minus a specific standard error. Where do you get the standard error? You get the standard error from the values generated in the research. Okay, so quantitative methods also will require a refinement in the interpretation of numeric data. Ang numeric data kasi hindi siya masyadong difficult. Hindi siya difficult to understand. Kasi pag sinabi mo ang temperature mo is 38 and you're using a standard instrument, let's say meron kang 100 students na dumadaan sa gate going to BU College of Science, yung first gate from from Legazpi. Okay? So prior to Camp Ola going to Daraga. So dapat ang ginagamit na tool for measuring temperature will be the same. So ang ginagamit natin is thermal scanner, which will be a digital scanner. Okay, dependent on the battery. So kung yung battery niyan medyo patapos na, hindi na yan efficient. So kung ginamit yan sa 100, tapos yung battery niyan hindi na gumaganang masyado. So towards the end of the 100, medyo pumapalpak-palpak na yan. So with numeric data, ang understanding, the assumption is that the instrument used to measure the behavior of the variable will be at its full potential. Kaya lahat nga ng steps doon sa research method talagang tinututukan. So numeric data will be understood for the value it is represented with. Okay, so when we use qualitative variables, okay, there will be less detail that can be provided because qualitative variables from the previous discussion will have some form of subjectivity when it is measured from one unit, sample unit, to another. Okay, so this will be the end of our discussion for today, which will be the preliminary part of quantitative methods. Thank you for your attention. Let me know if you have questions.